in the course of the conversation we had with Nigel, there were a number of people who just weighed in with elements of what's happening in the world of AI that certainly I didn't know about, and I think would be interesting just to make sure they're aired. Part of our thinking, inner thinking, is that you actually hear from people with different points of view, different experiences. I just wanted to come to Anushka Sharma first, because did you flag up, Anushka, something called Teams for AI, or is that what you're working on? So that sounds terrifying to me, and I think it's probably stopped immediately. So tell us what you're doing there.
Good morning. So it's not me directly, but it's an awesome organization called Teens in AI, who really run hackathons that bring together students and younger citizens of our sort of community, children and young teenagers who are interested in AI and machine learning. And they are matched with like experts from the field and mentored to really come with some really tangible sort of results over a sort of hackathon. And there was somebody, I think it was Katie in the chat, who also mentioned that her child was interested in sort of AI and computer science. And there's another organization called Cyber Fast Girls, which is much more geared towards cybersecurity solutions. And they also run hackathons. So there are really great ways to engage your children if they are interested in any such technology, because if we can kind of help build that kind of like, swell of interest at that young age, then hopefully the talent that we need in the next 10, 15, 20 years is something that we also have here and we've supported in the ecosystem.
Yeah. Well, Anushka, thank you, because I'm sort of immediately captured by what Nigel said about broadening the pyramid, about that Ian Duffy said about how you make this accessible at secondary school age. So we will certainly try to, as I said, we've got this Tortoise AI network that my colleague Alexandra Musavizadeh, I'm going to introduce in a minute, has built. But actually, we can get in touch with people like Teens in AI. That'd be great. I see that Venya, I think is her name, Venya Tiwari, says that she went to a hackathon and said it was amazing. So we should definitely get in touch with them. Thank you, Anushka. I also just wanted to sort of wave back at Paul Dowling, because Paul seems to be doing a bunch of these things. We should probably be hearing what you're doing in this space too, Paul.
Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity. I've been building kind of ecosystem around King's Cross with the Knowledge Quarter partners, which is really the likes of the Crick Institute, Turing, and the ODI do help us quite a lot. The main program that people could look at would be KQ Labs, which is run out of the Crick Institute and is data-driven health. But I also run the London PyTorch meetup, which is deep learning platform, and a load of other kind of boot camps and things like that. And at the moment, I'm just working on a quantum computing boot camp for the early spring. So basically, anybody who's interested in AI, particularly in health and quantum computing, I've left my LinkedIn on the in the feed. So and be happy to tell anybody anything they want to know about it.
Paul, thank you. That is fantastic. And the one other thing I just wanted to pick up, I don't know whether Marie Anastasio is here. Marie, there was just one thing I just wanted to touch on one thing, because as Nigel was speaking and talking about people on campus working in AI, you had this lovely comment in the chat, which was they equals researchers. I just wanted to know what you meant by that in terms of, I know we have the cult of the individual in every walk of life, and it's very quickly Demis Hassabis folded the protein. We misunderstand things pretty quickly. What was your point?
Oh, so actually I was more talking about I have nothing to sell, but the idea for me is that it's good to look at the ethic questions and the transparency of the data, etc. But there is a huge problem in the energy consumption. And we sometimes see some numbers, like the researchers sometimes give some information about how much energy was consumed. Like, but the numbers are scary. Like there is this one paper that consumes equals to I think it was 1 hour of nuclear power plant, right, just to train the networks for this one research paper. And I think that there is this question is not discussed enough.
No.
So that was mainly the point that I wanted to make.
But Marie, thank you. I hope that we will get to that, or that we will get to that subject, not least in the ethics question, because I think there is going to be some of these discussions about trade-offs, particularly on the energy side too. But Marie, thank you. I do wish, I rather do wish that Elena Senel, I think is the name, who's by the sounds of things is the CEO of Teens in AI, was here, because as you were speaking, Marie, there's this toll of people saying, I've been to a Teens in AI thing, and then other people, I saw Priya Guha suggested a way of getting in touch. So thank you, Priya. And I see there are a bunch of other things in this area. So we'll make sure to pull all of those things together. The quantum computing boot camp that Paul mentioned in the just now, and some of the suggestions in the chat, and make sure in the aftermath of this we'll pull all together things that we've learned and such kinds of groups and events as well. I kicked off this morning at 8:30 London time by saying, we're really brought together by the work that Tortoise has done in trying to understand a global race in AI and the Global AI Index. And when I say Tortoise, what I really mean is Alexandra Musavizadeh, Luke Bedemer, Kim Dara, Alexi Mostras, and Chris Newell, who together have tried to collate the data, interpret the data, and then present it in a way that is digestible, that someone like me can say, yes, that makes sense to me. We're going to now spend half an hour, if we might, just talking through the findings of the second Global AI Index. Because Alexandra, if you're there, you often worry with these indexes is that you're going to get to year 2, nothing has changed. Actually, it's probably more frightening and alarming that quite so much moves quite so quickly in a year. So do you want to start to take us through what you think the key findings are?
Yes, and thank you, James. It's been it's a big project, and by the way, it was so interesting to hear the comments from Anushka and Paul on the hackathons. But actually, this is something that we pick up in the index. We measure not just the sort of the formal educational side that we talked about with Nigel before, but we also try and map that sort of community and ecosystem that is seen through the meetups and the hackathons that Anushka and Paul were talking about before. So it was great to hear those comments. But thanks, James. This is the second edition of the index. We released this morning, so please do go on the website. I think Luke is going to pop it in the chat there, so everyone can go and see the fresh rankings and our detailed indicator table for those who want to dig deeper. But it is, when we released it last year, it marked already a year-long study on how we could best map, track, and measure this national AI ecosystem. And it's really interesting to see a year on how the results are changing, also according to sort of what you would expect, but really seeing it turn up in the data. So a few things I just want to mention before I dive into the things that have changed since last year is that we've added 8 new countries. So we're up to 62 countries. 4 years ago, there was not one single national AI strategy in the world. And today there are 62. So what we are doing, this index is in response to that, to help make sense of what goes in to support this complex area of development and deployment of AI. And so what we've seen, so some things haven't changed. The US, China, and the UK still retain their first, second, and third positions. And we see, but those positions are changing between each other. So what we're seeing is that China is now slowly, but definitely closing the gap between the US and China. And we've seen the UK lose a bit of its edge of its otherwise quite strong third position. And that is because we've seen the movement of other countries and smaller countries actually, such as Israel and Finland, but also France and Germany, really pick up their pace through their strengthening of their ecosystems and government strategies. And they're starting to nip at the heels of the UK position. So I think that what I think we have some slides that we want to put up as well, so we can see this actually in the charts. There we go. So everyone can see here, we've got the US up top and China number 2. The part that I think surprises the most when we issued the first edition last year is actually the gap between China and the US is quite big. So there's a big drop between the US and China, but that is now, as I said, starting to narrow. And one of the things, so while China is still behind on sort of private investment and talent and operating environment, we are really starting to see that gap closing, and it's catching up on aspects of research that's getting picked up in what we look at when we look at that, which is through the IEEE, which has actually outstripped the US by a factor of 7.
What, Alexandra? Through the what?
So it's the IEEE. It's an organization that assesses academic papers on AI, and if you get accepted to that, there's a certain quality stamp. And 10 years ago, there was not a lot of presence of Chinese papers on IEEE, and now there's a lot more, and it's now growing much faster than the US. But what we're also seeing is that we're seeing a growing number of computer science universities. We're seeing a lot more presence in China on the big coding platform that's called GitHub, where you see a lot of that community, working on their code and committing it to this platform called GitHub, which is a really good sense check on the activity in AI going on. And you see that rising in China now, and that's picking up. But you also see patents. So patents filed already surpassed the US 2 years ago, and is growing at a really rapid pace. So these are the things that we're seeing, where we're seeing that gap between China and the US closing. And of course, the question is that we often get is like, how long will it take for that gap to close? And it's of course hard to say, but on these trend lines, it could be sort of 7 to 10 years. And then I just want to draw your attention to the other thing that we've noted that is really interesting for this year, and is actually to see that the UK's position weaken somewhat. It's still third, but you definitely see the countries below the UK starting to pick up pace and starting to get much closer to the UK. And there is the next slide, I think, is quite interesting. If we could go to that and see actually how that is slipping against in its third position. And it's not one single factor that's driving this. It's just a lot of smaller things, such as a loss of a supercompute. So we're down from 11 to 10, a slight weakening on computer science focused universities in the UK. Not as many on online platforms when it comes to AI skills training as you see in other countries. So it's a lot of little things. And also what we're seeing is that the government strategy, which is something we talked about with Nigel before, is that the other countries such as Canada and Germany and the Netherlands and others, their strategies are really robust, and they're committing a lot of funding to AI and to research and to building of talent and building out of the infrastructure and compute power. And so that is one of the reasons where you see this, the UK is now slipping slightly against the other countries. And we get again, the question is like, how long would it take for the UK to potentially lose its position against Canada? And it's hard to say, but this is this could be maybe 2 or 3 more years if the UK is stagnant. But there is talk of a potential for a brand new AI strategy coming out of the UK government. So
Alexandra, forgive me for interrupting. Just so people because one of the difficulties is you sometimes feel like you've arrived in the middle of a conversation. So Susie Kershaw asked, what are we looking at? Susie, just so you know, the Tortoise Global AI Index is trying to map the strength of different countries and their AI capabilities in quite some detail. I saw that Mario Eigner said, what are the measurement units of the index, please? Just, so the aim of this session, this half hour, is to hear from Alexandra and her team exactly what we've seen, and that's why we're going to go through the slides, and we're going to go through the slides and then get into some of the methodology. Luke Venemer is going to just talk a little bit about that in a moment, just so you know what we're doing. Or Alexandra, sorry, let's.
That's and I hope you got the link in the chat, and you can also go and chew through details. But just top line, it measures the key components that go into the ecosystems of AI on a national basis. So we look at research strength, we look at talent, we look at the investment, both the public and the private, and we look at infrastructure and operating environment, but also looking at the government strategy itself, because the focus of the government strategy and the money that goes into putting the sort of the rails in which AI run on is very important as well. So those are the pillars that we look at. We look at 143 indicators that spread across these 7 pillars, and they're drawn from normal statistics on education, but we also do big scrapes of GitHub, where we get a sense of where the coding community is going. We look at meetups, we scrape Crunchbase to assess where the investments are going. So there's a whole load of both static but also live data parts that go into to really get a good sense of all of the building blocks that go into AI. And that's how we measure and rank the countries in the.
And Alexandra, this is the interesting thing about this next slide, if I read it right, is this speaks to your point, which is the gap between China and the US has closed a bit, and the UK's position as a sort of clear number 3, actually it's sort of slipped back, into the peloton.
Yeah, no, exactly. This chart should illustrate that quite clearly, hopefully. You've got in 2019, the UK was clearly, in that third position. You can see now it's slipping in 2020 into sort of closer to the sort of the next group of countries, which are really strong and moving fast, but it's definitely coming closer to those countries. And maybe before we just pass it on to Luke, I just wanted to say some of the, we ask what's changed since last year, apart from the sort of the dynamics between the big 3, but also looking at who are the big risers, who do we see that are really shooting through the index, and why is that? And here I just wanted to draw your attention to the ones that have made the sort of biggest strides that we wanted to pull out. And that's Israel, Netherlands, and Finland, all sort of with actually long-standing, deeply embedded focus on AI. And ecosystems that are really strong. I think Israel in particular has jumped, as you can see, from a 12th position to a 5th, and this is also on the strength that it has fared extremely well through the pandemic. Investment hasn't stopped. You've seen the talent and research community continuing to write and be excited and being active, and we see that through the activity on all of the sort of coding platforms are only picking up; they're not slowing down. In fact, Israel is has the highest, what you would call AI intensity in the world. If you look at AI startups as a proportion to the population, it is that you will find that is the strongest. It is above the US on that, and that continues and has not abated through the pandemic. Finland has a slightly different structure. They have a very strong talent and coding community, and that's where you see this rise coming from. And then the Netherlands as well, very much pulling ahead on talent and investment and research. So you see that the focus and attention going into these ecosystems are really paying off for these countries. And I thought I'd just probably leave you with those results on the sort of movers in the top end of the top 15 of the index before I pass it on to Luke.
Thank you, Alexandra. People I know are going to have thoughts, and one of the things we'll do is share the details of the team, because the thing that's so interesting about it is, as you say, is when you've explained it to me, is actually when you really get in the weeds of GitHub, or you get in the weeds of the IEEE, and you actually think, well, are those measurements realistic? There's one thing I just wanted to flag up before I go to Luke, Alexandra, which is this recurrent question of defense spending on AI and how it's accounted for, and whether or not you feel as though we're getting any greater transparency on what AI spending happens in the security realm.
Yeah, and it's such a tricky, and it is a good question and a tricky one for us to assess because it's in the dark. But we know so much of the AI talent and research and development comes from the military side. And looking at just also Israel's strengths, a lot of that is a lot of the depth and the knowledge on the cyber side and so on comes from what is going through the military. But it is and also on Russia, that we're going to speak about a bit later. A lot Russia doesn't really show up in the index at all, which is slightly surprising. And but you probably, if you were able to calculate the military spend, Russia would be probably significantly higher in the index. But we don't have access to that data point. But we are very aware that we don't see the input, but we definitely see the output. So and so that is one way to gauge how much funding potentially is going through the military on AI. And it was interesting to see the defense spending announcement the other day from the UK, and seeing how much of that is actually going into AI. So there's one lab, but there's also the question of the drones and the robotics side, where a fair amount of AI is going to be developed through that as well.
All right, thank you, Alexandra. Luke, I'm going to ask you a little bit just to sort of show us your workings, if you would. I saw that Kim was just sort of setting out what the key pillars are: talent, infrastructure, operating environment, research, development, government strategy, and commercial. Can you tell us a bit about the data points, the weightings, how you come to where we are?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as Alexandra's mentioned already, the index is the product of 2 sort of full years of work that's morphed into something that Tortoise is really trying to do very well, which is sense making. What we saw was the governments around the world with this national strategy initiative were really trying to make sense of the landscape of artificial intelligence when it came to the different types of capital that sit within the pillars we're talking about. So the human capital within talent, the investment and financial capital within the commercial ventures pillar that we look at. And so I think basically that combination of factors speaks to the underlying concept that we're looking at, which is capacity for artificial intelligence. And it's admittedly something that tries to take this big, complex, multifaceted phenomenon that very few people can agree on completely, and distill it down into some empirical metrics. And like Kim's been saying, we've got a mix of qualitative and quantitative, mix of survey data, mix of live stream data from the platforms that Alexandra talked about, and all of them sort of combine to speak to this level of activity and of capacity. So in terms of the weightings, James, the way that we look at it is through a combination of relevance, contribution, and reliability. And not to dwell on that too much, it's basically to ask the question of how much does this factor contribute to artificial intelligence specifically, rather than to, say, STEM or to kind of broader disciplines in science. How much of the entire data set can we see? How comprehensive and reliable is the data itself? So to give you an example, part of how we assess talent has been done in partnership with Element AI, and they look at LinkedIn predominantly, and there are some issues there with the penetration that LinkedIn gets in outside of the West. We know for a fact that the data, for example, in China is going to underrepresent technicians, engineers, data scientists in China. But the beauty of a composite index like the Global AI Index is that it has other metrics to supplement that overall concept, the concept of how much talent is there for AI in a given country. So I can't urge people enough to go and look at the new indicator table and breakdown of the methodology that sits on the website now, because the rest of the team's done a fantastic job in putting that together.
We're being too modest here. The thing is, the really great thing, now I can say this because actually I sit there and just sort of marvel, is I think there are few times, because there's a problem with sort of overreaching in authority when you do an index, that it is the last word. You know, the reality is this is really the first word. We're really clear, and I think what you've done and Alexandra and Kim is actually be really clear about the holes in the data. And part of this, I think, is to be clear with people, everyone who's joining us today, is to say, this is clearly one of the transformative forces in our world today, and we're not tracking it, and we're not understanding how it's going to reshape geopolitics and our own societies. And so our hope is that the data gets better and therefore the findings get more accurate. But if you like, your methodology statement, the thing I love about it is, there's a hole here, there's a patchy piece of data here. We're trying to be really open on what the problems are, aren't we, in this?
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's also this a natural development that's taking place alongside the sort of commercial and government or governance significance of AI. As that stuff goes on, so too do the efforts to measure and map it. And so I think the extent of the sort of the partnerships, the knowledge partnerships that we've got working with us alongside the index, the ways in which we're trying to take the network conversation in outside of the West into looking at China, they all speak to exactly that, right? We know that there is a long way to go in producing these completely comprehensive measures of such a complex and sort of phenomenal thing. But over the past year, and today is a fantastic example, it's about how this data, these findings can sit within a conversation that is going to get to some truth and some insight. And it was great to hear from Nigel, and it's great to hear from everybody in the chat. And I'm looking forward to the rest of today.
Can I just, one thing, Alexandra, I just want to do one thing, let's just go back to one slide, which is the sort of elongated Brazil, India, Russia slide for a second, just because Ivor Tucker asks a question, which is, what does the left scale represent? And just to explain it, you'll see it all, Ivor, on the website. I see Flo asks, can you give us all the detail? Can you just explain the 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100?
Yeah, but here's the scores of the countries in the index, and I think this is actually, I'm really glad we got back to this one, because the reason why we picked out Brazil, India, Russia, and South Africa, these are the scores on the index that you see. So where they sit on a score basis against each other. But Jim O'Neill coined the acronym BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And when he was, we were in conversation with him last week and reflecting over the results, he was saying, of course, what is interesting is that none of those big countries that had so much promise and potential 2 decades ago are nowhere to be seen up in the top end of this index. And reflecting on that was the thinking around how countries with a certain level of corruption are very reticent to digitize and create transparency around at least public services and to push that and push investment through that. And that is very much a sort of building block of AI. And so you might actually see that there is a correlation. If you were to correlate the findings of the scores of this index against corruption scores, you might actually see that there is a link there, and that these countries have just not, in Russia's case, not diversified or focused on diversification, and it might be one of the reasons, and putting everything it has through the military. But these are sort of what we would call the sort of conspicuously absent countries that you have seen sort of at the top of other rankings some decades ago, and are really absent in what is really forward pointing, which is the AI index, is really looking at, as Luke was saying, we're looking at the capacity that a country has for AI, but we're looking at that because it is that promise of the next step change in growth, right? It is the promise of the gains in productivity, and it is the hope for how we can create more efficient societies.
And Alexandra, can I ask, Sam Cabral says that if reading the rankings right, the UK's operating environment is relatively low. Is that right? Do other people have better?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And what does that mean, actually?
Well, on the operating environment, has data points such as, visa processes. It has data protection regulation. It has diversity. So it's like, so the operating environment that the AI sits in? Can the talent move in and out easily enough? Is it a diverse pool of talent that you have? Do you, that kind of thing? And actually, the UK doesn't do particularly well on that. It also doesn't do well on patents, which is interesting.
But I would just want to bring in Alexi Mostras, fellow editor and partner at Tortoise. Alexi, when you looked at this, was one of the things that we do is we have Alexi in on the team, essentially just rootling around for what we, in a very unscientific way, think of as stories. And when you look at this, Alexi, what do you think of the stories?
I mean, I think there are a huge number of jumping off points, to be honest. I mean, I noted down 4. One is China and geopolitics and how the country uses AI for geopolitical ends, which we're going to talk about in one of the sessions, in which there's some data on in the index itself. I'd really like to go to one of these smart cities that Chinese companies are exporting. There's a city in Serbia called Nice, which I'd like to go there and see what life is like under the AI revolution on the ground. There are still huge ethical questions to look at journalistically. There was someone on Twitter today who was saying that employees at certain AI companies are in certain circumstances prevented from raising concerns about algorithmic bias because the private company has no interest in such concerns being raised. So if there were any examples of effectively AI whistleblowers, then that would be very interesting journalistically. So Nigel touched on another really, really interesting journalistic subject, which is education and how to broaden the pyramid. And I think I agree with you that we should get inside companies and charities that are trying to do exactly that. And finally, methodologically, Tortoise has spent a long time last year looking at tech companies as nation states rather than as corporates. We've done a series called Tech Nations looking at Amazon and Apple. And I think a really interesting next step for the index would be to see if we can integrate Amazon and Apple and Facebook and the other big technology companies into the index and see how well we can correlate their own private AI capabilities with the national capabilities of, say, England or the US.
And Alexi, can I ask you a question? We often, and I take Alexandra's point that the index has the capacity of being forward-leaning, but we often treat AI, and actually journalists, newsrooms often treat all technology subjects as a study in futurology. What it seems to me is the case that the closer we look at this is what we've come to think of as nowology. There's a lot of AI in a lot of our businesses and working lives, and I wonder whether or not Nigel Shadbolt said at the end there, he referred passingly to consumerization of AI, right? Which I imagine means it's going to be in my life. And I wonder whether we're beginning to see that, whether there's a way of capturing that in the index.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. And one of the sessions that we're going to do later on breakthroughs, I spoke to one of the participants before, and he was an investor, and he was saying that they don't look for investment in AI companies anymore because everyone uses AI. A biotech company that they're investing in is just a biotech company that they presume will be using some sort of machine learning. So it's very much the case that these innovations are taking place currently. And I think it would be really smart to work out how we integrate that current innovation into the index itself. Yeah.
Well, we'll do that. I also just wanted to pick up on a point, if I might, that Kevin Flanagan made, because I remember when we were doing some of the kind of data scrapes right at the beginning, Alexandra, we touched on this, which was the direction of travel of the best PhD students, postdoc researchers. And Kevin Flanagan asks, how many of the US's AI scientists are Chinese? I.e., how many people are moving into different places? And I'm suppose he's asking that. I might actually turn to Kevin Flanagan to make the point for himself. But Alexandra, do you want to just say how we're looking at the movement of quote unquote talent in the AI world?
Yeah, I think, it's something that gets a lot of attention because of the importance of sharing and collaboration for purposes of innovating, and it's really critical. So when 4 years of Trump did see a very big drop off of Chinese talent flowing into the US. I mean, you look at some of the statistics of the big universities that are AI focused in China, and there's a quite significant proportion of those that do go traditionally to the US. And some the other way, but mostly Chinese to the US. So, and that's very interesting. And it has dropped off in the last 3 to 4 years. And it's interesting to see if with Biden, whether that comes back. Yeah.
Kevin, are you there? Are you able to sort of weigh in? The reason
the question I was asking was because I read something that a big problem that's now occurring, particularly in defense, but also in telecoms, is that a lot of Chinese origin scientists who emigrated to the US to do their AI degrees, because that was the only place you could do the research 20 years ago, really, are being pressured through strategic, shall we say, pressure on their extended families, come back with your knowledge or bad things will happen. And I read this article, I think it was in, might have been even the FT, and it occurred to me that when you put up the index, okay, China's ahead, but or the US is at the top, but how many of those scientists are actually ethnically Chinese and therefore perhaps susceptible to pressure to return back to China and therefore flip that index very quickly?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that I've read similar stories, and it's China is very much looking at, I think, trying to sort of ring fence or trying to first of all drive up its talent pool, and this is one way to do it. But also one of the key things that it's looking to develop that it hasn't had previously is the semiconductor, the chip manufacturing. That it has it's had to import and now trying to develop its own chip manufacturing base. So those are sort of, and that's critical for AI. And you can see that there's, a lot of investment and focus going into that. And also to some degree, trying to pull the talent back. And there's stories also of very big salaries being promised and all of that. I'm not sure that will necessarily, it could accelerate the trends that we're seeing now, but yes, to your point.
I mean, just to make an obvious point, it's really striking this week. I don't know whether you saw, overnight the comments at the Aspen Institute about China's, foreign policy push to influence the Biden administration, not just the incoming members of the administration, but the people around those incoming members of the administration. And then at the same time, you saw what happened in Iran, taking out a top scientist, the extent to which we may be at a new stage where the old arguments between hard power and soft power have a new complement in intellectual power, and then who has the access and ownership over that intellectual power is potentially a really interesting subject. So Kevin, we will definitely look into that. I think it'll be really interesting. It's massively complicated, of course, because how people even identify themselves and their own loyalties is sometimes a mystery to themselves, let alone to journalist inquiry. But yeah, Kevin, thank you. We'll listen, I'll look up and follow that up. Alexandra, can I just go to you just at the end? One of the things that's really interesting here is the number of people who in different ways are really, really keen on understanding the methodology. Luke mentioned what's on the website. How do you, if you're really interested in this area, actually sort of get in touch with you and the team, to argue those points out? What's the best way of doing that?
Well, get in touch with me directly on my email, alexandra@tortoisemedia.com, and we do monthly roundtables where we host discussions about the nitty-gritty of the index by country, by pillar, and all the things that go into it, and sometimes some of the methodological aspects as well. But get in touch, and we're very happy to maybe have a separate session where we can chew through all of the issues that we encounter when we put such a big index together, and the weightings and the data that we pull together. Would be delighted to talk that through with anyone. But we do, as Luke was pointing to, we have an AI network. As I said, it's 62 countries that we have in the index. We're really seeking to and already engaging with many of the countries that are in the index to help making sense. Essentially, this is a deep sense maker out of Tortoise to help make sense of how to map, as I said, and measure this ecosystem. And so we're drawing in conversations with countries that are going through this process of mapping their strategy and looking at how they're doing, and that also helps us refine our thinking and our data collection and the sources that we might change to or add into the methodology. But to answer your question, James, it is, please get in touch with us here at Tortoise and the team, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
And the reason, just so everyone knows, the reason why we, one of our thoughts has been that when you look at these indexes, they're so often faceless. You've no idea who's making decisions, on what grounds are they making the decisions, what recourse do you have when you think those decisions have been made in error on the basis of data that is misleading. So for everyone who's joining us today, please do follow up with Alexandra, with Luke, with Kim, and with Alexi. One of the sort of wise owls in this mix is Chris Newell, who runs all of our data visualizations and graphics. And as you'll see when we go into the next session, continues to put together the slides that I hope make sense of some of this detail. In the course of the remainder of our summit today, we're going to talk in the next session at the top of the hour about competition, about global competitiveness, and try and look in some detail at whether or not those AI strategies that Alexandra's mentioned are really translating into fundamental changes in AI capability, and if so, where. We're then going to have a session that's led by Alexi Mostras, where we're going to talk about talent. And so I hope that we'll deal with some of the points I've seen in the chat around diversity, but we'll also deal with some of the questions around, private versus public, universities versus schools, and the movement of talent globally. Matt D'Ancona is going to follow with a session on ethics. And I appreciated Marie's point about emissions, but there is this whole range of questions about autonomy, security, oversight, and the institutional innovations that may be needed given the power of AI. And then Alexi is back, I hope, after that with the sunny uplands, with an idea of what the breakthroughs might be, building on what we've learned this week around DeepMind and AlphaFold. What comes next? Not for that company, but for the sector as a whole. So please do join us. We're going to give you, I can't believe our generosity here, a full 12 minutes to sort of get something to drink, take a walk around, heaven knows, even switch off the screen for a moment. But do come back at the top of the hour. We're going to be looking at global competitiveness in AI. Thank you, Alexandra, Luke, Alexi, and Kim. See you all in 10 minutes' time.
Thank you.